So our guest today is a former sound designer for LucasArts and sound supervisor. He's also a voice actor. He's a host of the digital stage at Star Wars Celebration. Mm-hmm. He is also the host of the new show, The Comlink, where he gets to interview many people like Kevin Smith was on there recently, which is pretty awesome, about Star Wars, of course. He's also one of the hosts for Star Wars Oxygen, the music of Star Wars, the music of John Williams, which is a show I definitely love. And even my wife loves, one of the few podcasts she actually really likes. So if you haven't guessed who this is yet, our guest is David W. Collins, returning to the show for the second time to discuss sound of Star Wars. Welcome back to the show, David Collins. It's been has it been a year?
Yeah, I think it's been about a year. I'm not sure, but yeah, thanks for having me again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love listening to your show, Star Wars Oxygen, and of course you just started Comlink as well.
Yeah, we've been doing Star Wars Oxygen for, I can't believe it, but it's almost been a year. We're approaching our 12th volume coming up here pretty soon, and then J.C. Reifenberg and I started doing this show called The Comlink, as you mentioned, which for any of your listeners haven't had a chance to check it out, is actually on Kevin Smith's CSMOD YouTube channel, and J.C. has an ongoing relationship with Kevin. And so we just decided we really wanted to do something in the video space because there isn't any sort of source for Star Wars news and commentary and interviews in the short-form video space. Of course, you can click and watch the extended interviews as well, but we have quite a season lined up, and between that and Oxygen, it's been all Star Wars all the time, but it's been great.
One question actually my little brother had about Oxygen. Are you guys, after you get to the movies and you get to Episode 7, are you guys eventually going to hit on, like, Jesse Harlan's stuff, or I forgot some of the other composers, or Kevin Kiner stuff, like the other Star Wars music? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, Jesse's a really good friend of mine, so it'd be great to get him on the show, and Mark Risky's a good friend of mine as well. But I mean, I worked so closely with those guys, and was one of the producers on the original Force Unleashed score, and worked with Jesse on Republic Commando, and was really, really involved in a lot of those LucasArts scores, and I just love their music. I'm a huge fan of Jesse's. He recently did a game called Counter Spy for Sony, which is where I am now, Sony PlayStation. And I just think he's an incredible composer. A lot of great composers have come through. But, yeah, we want to do – it is the music of John Williams, right? So we want to do the 6 films first. However, there's so much music in the Star Wars galaxy. We've had a lot of requests for Joel McNeely's Shadows of the Empire score. We've had, yeah, I mean, that's a great score. A lot of things in the Clone Wars I want to cover, Rebels I want to cover, and, of course, video games. I would just love to just keep going as long as there's time and people want to listen, and I just keep it going into the future. And certainly when we get to video game scores, the accessibility goes way up. I'd love to have some of those guys on the show.
Maybe one thing you could do is just when you get to a point where you have an open episode, just do a poll and ask us which game you want us to have you talk about the music of, and then
absolutely,
whatever wins be the first one, and then go from there.
That would be great. Absolutely, I'd love to do a listener poll, and people could just kind of write in and say, because it would be hard to. The only plan that we have right now is that it's film focused, because that's Star Wars is originally and still, I think, at its core, a film franchise. And, and everything that we've done from there kind of is all about paying homage to those films that just kind of changed all of us and made us fans, right? So we really want to cover the Star Wars films, but there are only so many, and we're moving through them pretty fast. I mean, we're already in Return of the Jedi now, and I can definitely see us getting into other ones very, very quickly, besides the ones that we know that are coming. There's a lot of music out there to cover, and a lot of great projects that people are really devoted fans of.
And you're about to hit my favorite soundtrack in the Star Wars saga, Phantom Menace, really soon, and I'm excited.
Yeah, Phantom Menace is a great, great soundtrack. I don't want to give any.
I want to hear you talk about Augie's Great Municipal Band.
Oh, of course.
That song is. I did percussion in middle and high school, and that song is like a dream. There's like 30 instruments that percussion gets to play. It's just fun. Oh, yeah, absolutely. The talking drums and, of course, all the marching snares that are just kind of doing their thing. That stuff is great. Yeah, we'll, of course, talk about Augie's Municipal Band and, of course, Duel of the Fates. There's so much that was introduced in the Phantom Menace that's new, but
that's all coming probably in 2015. I think we'll probably close out the year with Return of the Jedi and give it its due, at least 4 volumes. We spent 5 on Empire, but one of them was kind of transitional. But we're just loving the show. Jimmy is just so great, and the combination of, going deep in there, but also having it be accessible has just been something that we've gotten a lot of great feedback on, and I'm really glad that people are so interested. And as long as they are, heck, I'll keep talking about it because I love this stuff.
Well, you mentioned Jesse Harlan, and he's actually our guest next week on the show.
Oh, great.
And he says, I need to ask you about the lyrics to the Force Unleashed main theme.
Oh, yeah, okay. So Sam Witwer and I have been friends for a long time. So Sam, and that's kind of the origin of this story. So Sam went to Juilliard with my best friend Patrick from childhood. And so I met Sam long before The Force Unleashed. We've been friends for about, 15 years or so. And when he was in The Force Unleashed, we just had a lot of fun together. And, we just started making up lyrics because Sam makes up lyrics to, well, everything. And so, it just turned into this like crooning, ridiculous thing where, he'd start doing a da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and it would just turn into, you are Force Unleashed, Star Killer. Like, it just got ridiculous. Darth Vader's like, it was one of those things that we do, like, after a shoot or after the wrap party and, everyone was out for, dinner or whatever, and just became this, like, totally ridiculous thing. And, of course, we had to, after a while, we were leaving obnoxious messages on Jesse Harlan's voicemail at work, on his work line, just doing that kind of stuff. Because, Jesse and I shared a wall for God, it feels like 10 years. He was always in the office next to mine at the Presidio in San Francisco, and so I was always hearing his low end, brass, and he was always hearing the explosions coming out of my office as we were working together, and so we just all got really close because you're working so many hours on something that you love. And yeah, I don't know who came up with those lyrics, but I should probably give credit to Sam, unless it's embarrassing, then I should take credit for it. But yeah, that's exactly what he meant. Those are the lyrics, and I don't know if there were. Now you have to ask him about his lyrics to Republic Commando, because when we were doing Star Wars Republic Commando, before Jesse started, I remember writing this music design document, and I was the audio lead at the time, which meant that I was supposed to kind of figure out everything that was going to happen design-wise that comes out of the speakers, voiceover, sound, and music. And Jesse came on, and it was like, here you go. I have this idea. We should use this sort of like almost like a nationalist, almost Russian Rimsky-Korsakov or Prokofiev or one of those really proud Russian composers from the late 19th, early 20th century. And how about a men's choir, because that'll be kind of the military thing and almost kind of the anti-Halo, right? I remember there was this idea. I remember when Halo came out. I remember being at LucasArts when Halo came out, and the Xbox came out, and I was working on Star Wars Obi-Wan, and suddenly I see this game, and someone from QA actually gave me a copy. He's like, hey, I got an extra copy. You want this? And I said, sure, and I played it. And I started realizing how popular this game was getting online, and I remember going to my friends and at lunch and going, guys, there's some Microsoft game with a giant green stormtrooper on the front that's kicking our butts right now. Like, we got to do something about this. Because to me, I was like, well, Master Chief is a stormtrooper that's been kind of re-armored. Why aren't we doing something with ARC troopers or whatever? And that's not why Republic Commando happened, but it just so happened that, there was this idea brewing amongst Tim Longo and Darren Stinnett to do a game that was like, the longest day of the war, like just the Battle of Geonosis, about, these clone troopers, and there were going to be special troopers. This was before ARC troopers even existed. We didn't know what those were. This is like 2002. Attack of the Clones had just come out, and I had finished a game called Star Wars Bounty Hunter, and we started working on this game, and the more I heard about it, I was like, well, it should have this kind of like men's choir, like this really just guttural men's choir in it. And I gave that idea to Jesse, and Jesse came up with the language. I remember saying, well, maybe it should be like an ancient Mandalorian. That's all I said, because I was just thinking, well, Jango Fett, maybe I mean, just pulling out stories out of thin air, because there was no canon about this stuff. There was no, Karen Traviss novels. There was nothing. There was no Clone Wars. And so Jesse took it, and he's got a great language background, and so does his wife. And he just, I'm going to stop there. Ask him next week about the lyrics and the language he wrote for the score for Republic Commando.
Will do, and I have it noted right here to make sure I ask. He actually, we're going to start getting the sound stuff right here. Here's one more question I should ask you, but I want to wait to the end for that one. But so you worked on Republic Commando and Demolition and Obi-Wan and Bounty Hunter and so on. So especially early on, one of the biggest challenges I know when it came to Star Wars games, at least for me, was did it sound like Star Wars? Because Star Wars has a very distinct sound. You can close your eyes and listen, and you know it's Star Wars. As a sound designer and a sound supervisor, how challenging was it to create Star Wars for the ears, especially with technology not being able to record as well as the movies could?
Sure, that's a great question. So it was very challenging. It's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, you have some of the greatest sounds at your fingertips ever. Some of the most famous sounds ever. If you put the sound of a TIE fighter squealing, and if you put that in there, you put that in there, you put a lightsaber, you put a blaster, you put Darth Vader breathing, people are going to love it, right? That is the saving grace. On the other hand, you better make sure that the sounds that you're making fit and just feel like Star Wars, right? The best compliments we would get were also the most frustrating reviews that we would get, which is that, yep, game sounds great. Sounds were pulled straight from the movies. Because it's not wrong. There are, we heavily relied on sounds from the movies. But if you made your own sounds, you better be sure that those sounds fit with what Ben Burt or Matt Wood or Dave Acord or any of those brilliant guys at Sky Sound were doing. A great example that I always give everybody is that in the Force Unleashed, we had the planet Felucia that you visited not once but twice. The first time it was very lush. The second time it had been kind of torched and taken over by the Empire. In Episode 3, you are on Felucia for about not even 10 seconds, maybe 10 to 15 seconds, as you're watching Aayla Secura die. And it's mostly music, because it's during a sequence, a montage where Order 66 is happening. It's not like you can just pull 3.5 hours of gameplay out of that. I mean, you really have to actualize these worlds that are appearing in just a few seconds in the movies, right? And sometimes it's really simple and sometimes it's really complex. And I remember with Republic Commando having to make a whole suite of weapons, and they didn't want it to sound like the standard blasters, right? And so for that game, I started out with almost like ballistic sounding machine gun type of weapons. And slowly, the pendulum swung back and towards the middle to where it felt a little bit more like Ben Burt, because you needed to have some of that classic blaster in there, but I wanted it to sound slightly ballistic. The pistol, I wanted to sound like a cracking pistol, but also wanted that Han Solo sound. The shotgun is kind of its own thing. The Trandoshan shotgun, the rocket launcher, the crossbow, just all this stuff that we didn't really have reference for needed to sound like Star Wars. And so the easiest way to do it, and I think the trick that I utilized a lot, was just mixing in elements. And if you did that, then people just kind of bought it,
Did you ever have to go out and do what Ben Burt had to do and actually record your own sound effects to get the sounds you wanted, rather than just using the library and mixing things?
Absolutely, all the time. I mean, you need to be recording anything and everything. We were recording props, we were recording Foley and sound effects. We'd go out and record. We did a gun shoot at one point in order to get a lot of ricochet sounds. We went to Travis Air Force Base at one point and got a lot of hydraulic sounds that are all over Republic Commando. And I was constantly stealing from other titles as well. I remember doing a World War II plane recording for a game called Secret Weapons over Normandy. And, processing and pitching and heavily utilizing a lot of those sounds as well, because we didn't have full access to the Skywalker sound library, because that was really more on the film side, and it was very political because of Warner Brothers and Paramount or any of their other clients, right? It was just a difficult thing when you do games. These single assets go out, and that's very scary, when you're building a huge library. So we were really doing our own thing at LucasArts, kind of under the wing of Lucasfilm, and not really a part of Skywalker Sound until later on, and that's when we really started going up there all the time for like the score for The Force Unleashed and doing a lot of the, like, all those Old Republic movies. I was kind of the sound supervisor on that, and we mixed all those Old Republic movies, like those trailers up at the ranch, that kind of stuff. But especially back in the days of like Obi-Wan, Bounty Hunter, that was, we had very few commercial libraries, and then we had some Star Wars sounds. And then every time a movie came out, we would get dumps of those sounds, that kind of thing, the new movie sounds. But we had to just record anything and everything we could. But something about the early days, the early days, we also didn't have a lot of memory, and we didn't have a lot of fidelity, right? If you think about, you do podcasts, when you upload something that, chances are even an MP3 of your show in stereo is probably, I don't know, a few hundred megabytes maybe. Yeah. And that's an MP3. So to put that in perspective, when you were working on the PlayStation 1, you could load 500K of memory, of sound into memory. That's how much memory you had on the PlayStation 1.
Cool.
500K. So the way you would do that is that you would, first of all, downsample it to like 5K or 11K kilohertz, right? As opposed to 44 kilohertz. What it is too technical for the podcast maybe, but you would downsample it and you would compress it, and so the fidelity kind of, when you have a lower bit depth and sample rate, not to get too technical, but it just sounds like crap. It's got that old sort of what they call 8-bit, like 8-bit sound and 8-bit music, like the Nintendo days. People seem to know that, but 8 bits literally is like 8-bit sound is like, it sounds grainy and there's no definition, And so that's what you had to do. And then you jump to the PlayStation 2 and it was like 2 megabytes, right? It was 4 times the memory, but it was still only 2 megabytes of loaded sound. So you're loading and unloading and you're streaming and, all kinds of technical stuff. But basically, it was a constant juggle of resources because you only have so much memory that you can use for sound, and you had to be very smart about it. And then once you jump to like the Xbox, and then the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, and of course now on the PlayStation 4, you've got so much memory, and you're doing such high fidelity sound work and so many variations that it's not really an issue like it was back in the day. But especially in those early days on the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2, it wasn't easy making it sound like a movie. Cinematics, sure. Like Star Wars Bounty Hunter cinematics, like we went nuts on those. But gameplay, it was tough.
Was there ever a time where you guys just couldn't get the sound that you wanted for Star Wars, and so you had to resort to just pumping up the music and hoping that covers up any failure or just inability to be able to get it to sound like you wanted it, especially with the older games? And also, which is your favorite moment that you've been part of or been able to create in Star Wars games that you felt that you created, honest to goodness, awesome Star Wars?
Oh, those are good questions. So music in general was always an easy win, especially in the early days, because if you streamed John Williams, again, people loved it, right? There's only so much John Williams music that you can stream, though, right? Because, and I always say this to people, it's, there's, especially in the early days when we only had maybe 4 films to pull from, that's all we had the rights to. We couldn't use like Shadows of the Empire or any of that stuff. You can't use Han and Leia's theme. You can't use Yoda's theme. You can't use, a lot of the love themes or the really specific, character themes, because, or a lot of the underscore. You only had so many themes you could use before people were like, wait a second, that's Yoda. Why are you playing Yoda over this, scene with this, character, this, Kyle Katarn or whatever, and some of those games did that in the early days, but as it became more and more sophisticated, and Jesse was actually a big part of this, he started really kind of policing how the music was used. It's like, you don't want to use those character motifs over, different characters that we're introducing. They want to have their own motifs. You can use action cues, maybe more generic action cues from the movies, and edit that together. But that only takes you so far. Then you're only talking about maybe 2 or 3 hours of music at the very most that you can pull from and loop and change around in different ways. That just feels like Star Wars, but isn't necessarily readily recognizable as, Yoda's theme or Leia's theme, right? Or Luke and Leia's theme. So, but that being said, music could stream very high fidelity off of a PlayStation 2 disc, right? It's just streaming off the disc the way like a CD would. So, you don't have to load music into memory. It's just streaming off the disc. It's seeking. You could actually hear it. If it was in your living room, you could actually hear it, looking for the music and seeking. It's not loaded into the very, very little amounts of memory that we had at the time. So music was a huge win, especially if you go back and play a PlayStation 1 game. That's a little bit before my time. I worked on one PlayStation 1 game, my first Star Wars game, Star Wars Demolition. You brought it up. But music was a huge win back then because you just couldn't get the fidelity with the technology at the time. And that's why, early games are almost entirely music,
Yeah, Shadows of the Empire especially, there's music was what I remember the most, is the soundtrack for that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The other thing is, the other question about making something awesome. To me, making Battlefront 2 was pretty incredible. But and I know that that's a huge favorite for people, but for me, it was really Republic Commando was the first time that I felt like I made something that I truly felt like was a personal expression of Star Wars for me, because I was the lead on the game. I worked on that game it was almost 2 solid years of my life, when everything else just fades away and you're just working on one thing. Every sound, all the integration, the design, everything. I was me and Jesse and our friend Harrison on dialogue, and that was it. It was a very small team, and we worked on it for a long time. And there were only 50, 60 people on the team, which is, by today's standards, maybe half of what a huge game like an Assassin's Creed would have, maybe less than half. That and the first Force Unleashed. I remember when we sat down and read Hayden's script and we did a table read of the Force Unleashed. It was amazing, and it was a really exciting time too, because we didn't know what was brewing at Lucasfilm Animation, and George had kind of quietly announced his retirement at the time, the first time, after Episode 3, and we thought, wow, this is really going to be a huge thing, and it was a big thing, but we also made a Jedi that could pull a Star Destroyer out of the sky, which in a lot of ways kind of breaks Star Wars. Well, once you can do that, then, but that was the whole concept of the game. It made for a great game. You've never seen that before, and that's what we were trying to do. New console, new technology, new story. It needed to feel like the hero's journey, kind of like a negative of Luke Skywalker. This was a dark side journey, trying to find redemption. And I remember just being so in love with that game. And the chance to work on it with friends was incredible.
Well, I know another fan favorite, of course, is I remember when that first Old Republic trailer came out, watching it again and again and again, just watching it over and over. For me, that I remember watching the trailers for that game anytime one came out, and that was like watching a new Star Wars movie for me.
Yeah.
What were the challenges with creating the sound side of that trailer? Because the sound is, like, I've used the sound effects before because I talk with BioWare Austin a lot, and I talk with a lot of their people. And pulling the sound effects and sound from those is amazing, because you can tell exactly where you are from just the sound. What were the challenges with the sound behind those, the Old Republic stuff? And then how do you feel you guys did on that?
I'm glad you brought this up. That's the closest I've ever come to making a Star Wars film myself. There was a period of time where we were working with Blur Studios, who did all the visuals for that, for the Old Republic trailers and the Force Unleashed 2 trailers. And I think a couple of Force Unleashed 1 commercials. No, those were Force Unleashed 2, out in the snow and the big Force push where Vader goes through the multiple walls. Blur Studios was, just doing this incredible stuff. A guy named Dave Wilson was the director, and those guys worked relentlessly and tirelessly to do, the most amazing visuals, and they really were doing the best work in video games in terms of cinematics and trailers. And I think the biggest challenge was, getting everyone to understand that this is not a trailer. This is they were like 5 minutes. Right, they weren't trailers; they were short films,
Yeah. Even the intro cinematic. It was a short film of awesome.
Yeah, it was. It was a short film, and I remember this was 2000. Was it 2008 or 2009? I think it was 2008.
I think the first one came out in 2009.
Was it 2009? E3 2009? Maybe it was.
Yeah.
Yes, it was E3 2009. You're right. And so I remember we mixed that at Skywalker. Someone that I'd been working with since Star Wars Bounty Hunter. It's a guy named Eric Foreman at Sky Sound. He's a good friend of mine. And Eric was going to mix, and we got a mix stage, and we had Denny Thorpe and Jana Vance do all the Foley. They were the Foley artists that did all the prequels. And Denny's been around. She walked Foley on Return of the Jedi. And so she walked Foley on that. We really, really got involved in Skywalker, and I was assigning, okay, you, Tom Bible, do the lightsabers. You edit the Foley. I'm gonna do the ship crash. I remember I did the ship crash design, and the very end battle I remember didn't come on board until we were on the mix stage in terms of the end invasion with all the ships flying over and the building crumbling. So there were certain moments that we were making on the mix stage because the thing was coming in so last minute. So while Eric was mixing, I was on headphones on a separate Pro Tools rig, cutting sound and just kind of designing stuff for those ships flying in at the very end and all those laser blasts coming in at the very end, as they're flying over the camera.
Yeah, the finale, yeah.
And Eric crafting the lightsaber drop, the kind of surreal lightsaber drop, and a lot of those moments he was crafting in the mix, and it was just coming on so late. It was the scope of the thing, and because that was I think our second time at bat at putting together an Old Republic trailer. It was the scope of the thing that was so challenging. Probably one of my most fun memories was hiring a loop group and taking them to the scoring stage and taking a bunch of actors and putting together that crowd. There was that crowd of hundreds of Jedi and hundreds of Sith coming after each other, and that sound, I worked on that for a long time, spotting every single hit and people screaming when they're catching on fire from I think it's Shape Isla.
The bounty hunter, the Mandalorian.
Yeah, and all the Darth Malgus stuff. And actually, here's an interesting piece of trivia about that. Darth Malgus was voiced in those trailers by Jamie Glover, who is a British actor whose father is Julian Glover, a.k.a. General Veers.
Really?
So Jamie Glover is the voice of, what's 100 years. Yeah, that whole thing.
You are deceived.
Yeah, you are deceived. That's Jamie. I mean, I pitched him down a little bit, and I did a little mask effect on his vocal, but, getting all that ADR and, all the efforts right during the lightsaber fight and all that stuff just coming on. We had a bunch of people working on it, and then you put it out, and nobody know who did it. Nobody know where it came from. There were no credits. There was no anything. It just went out like a trailer. And all of us just sat back like, God, we just made like a little short film here, and then
no one knows. BioWare gets all the credit.
Yeah, no, but it was Todd Davies, who is the lead sound designer on that, is actually a good friend of mine, and we used to work together at LucasArts. So, the BioWare guys, of course, were involved in the creative and all of that stuff. But they used us to do the sound on those trailers, and my only other involvement in the Old Republic is I was one of the voice directors. But in terms of sound design, I was the supervisor on those first two movies, that one and Hope, right? And you can hear a lot of my Republic Commando stuff at the top of Hope when those guys are kind of locked.
Yeah, the For the Republic stuff, I thought that came from... Okay, that makes a lot more sense now, although the sounds are all very familiar.
My favorite sounds that I designed specifically for that trailer, and probably my favorite weapon sounds, and I think the last weapon sounds I did at LucasArts, were the sound of the giant hand cannon that character has. That's sprung, sprung, sprung. That's
yeah.
And then the just the giant Gatling repeater that the other Republic trooper has. Doing that trailer was super, super fun, and again, a ton of work. And then my only regret for leaving is that I kind of submitted a budget for that last really big one, the big lightsaber fight in the hangar.
Yeah, the intro cinematic.
Yeah, and I didn't get to work on that. But the one that I just am the most proud of is the Force Unleashed 2, not the arena trailer, but the one where Sam is with Vader and he's in chains and eventually, goes out and he force repulses like a ton of stormtroopers and fights this guy at the end. And do you remember this trailer? It was another Blur trailer.
Yeah, he goes out and basically he breaks out of prison and kills a whole ton of stormtroopers.
Yep. I voiced a lot of those stormtroopers and I did that whole thing in my office next to Jesse, because we didn't have the time, we didn't have the budget, you know, and I just really, you know, because I was so close to the Force Unleashed, I have to admit I selfishly hoarded it to myself just to see if I could just do it alone in my office. So that trailer I mixed and did the sound design for, but those trailers are too big. Now, it takes an army to do those, so I had a lot of help on all that stuff. And a lot of really talented friends, you know, did amazing work on those.
So I can relate to some of this because right now, just because I've really wanted to do a radio drama before, we're actually, I'm doing the editing for a Star Wars fan drama they've recorded. Now I'm doing the sound editing, and there's some really, you know, sometimes being a fan is my biggest adversary because there's some things I have to get right, and it's really hard to get them right.
Right.
Have you ever had a scene or a type of scene where, as a fan, you knew you just had to get this right, and it was extremely challenging for you to get it right as well as Star Wars should be?
Yeah, I think I wish I had more time on The Force Unleashed 2. I mean, that's the whole story of that entire game, right? I mean, we just didn't have any time. And that's, you know, that's why the game's so short, you know, but we put the same amount of love into it for what we could do and just made a very, rather than make a really long, you know, game that felt unfinished, we made a really short game to try and give it the same polish that we had, you know, gotten to on the first one. Whereas on the first one, you know, I remember, I mean, I did all the cinematics on the first and the second one, and that was really the fun part, you know, was mixing all that. And the first one, I think, had like about 45, 50 minutes of cinematics, and so it was like making a little movie, you know. And I just remember thinking, I have to get this story right. We've put so much time and so much money and so much energy into this, and the whole company's looking at us right now. And I just remember mixing those. And when you're mixing, you know, it's never right. You just stop. Because after a while you're mixing in circles, you know. So at some point in any creative project, you just have to say it's good enough. You know, you can't just keep going because I remember working with I worked on a game called Journey, which was and when I say I worked on it, I was managing the sound designer that killed it.
The PS3 one, with Austin Wintory's awesome score. Yeah,
and Austin Wintory was the composer, and all of the sound in that game, and I mean every single sound in that game was done by one sound designer, and he was an employee in my department. His name was Steve Johnson. I was Steve's manager, and I remember Steve worked himself, I mean, to the bone on that project. It was such a passion project for him, and I just remember feeling like, you know, I remember watching him struggle to let go because he was in love with it. And that's what happens. You fall in love with these things and you don't want to let it go because it's never good enough. And in that particular game, I mean, he was given the opportunity to iterate and make it better and better and better. And it got better, you know, and he had been working with that company. He had done Flower, which is a brilliant PS3 game. And then he worked on Journey, and it was a real struggle to let go at the end, you know, because he had all of these things that he still wanted to get done. But you lose perspective when you're mixing, and that definitely happened to me on several Star Wars games where I just wanted to make it better and I just couldn't. I was out of time. And then I remember when one of the DVDs came out, Ben Burt had this quote where he said, "Films aren't released, they escape." And what he meant by that is that you're never done with a movie; it just has to go out, and you just abandon it. And there's a whole documentary, I think, on the Episode 2 DVD called Films Aren't Released, They Escape, and it's about the sound of Episode 2. And I just took a lot of comfort in that because it made me realize that that's like a universal phenomenon. Every creative feels that way. It's never good enough. You want to keep pushing yourself, especially when you love it, like Star Wars, you know.
Okay, so we got to wrap this up, but there's 3 questions left that, if we can ask them, we'll see if we can get to them all.
Sure.
So the first one is another Jesse one. He says, ask you about Sam Witwer's remixed / extended versions of Star Wars scenes from the original trilogy.
So Sam is, you know, they're not available anymore, but Sam made these really funny, this is before he was working on Star Wars, so his position is very different now. Sam's very, very funny and very talented, and he made these really hilarious extended versions, like, you know, if you're watching the scene between Luke and Yoda, the scene would just kind of keep going and like almost like, well, this is the bit that was deleted, you know, and he would just improvise this dialogue, and it was very funny, but it wasn't necessarily PG rated. So Those things aren't around and on the web anymore. But for a while, like, I mean, Jesse knew Sam. We all knew Sam before Sam was in The Force Unleashed. But at least in the sound department, nobody really knew who he was, and he was getting. I mean, he did Dexter and Battlestar Galactica and all these other shows, and his career just took off. And then he was cast in The Force Unleashed, and we actively pretended like we didn't know who he was, because I didn't want anyone to think that we were, I didn't want to have anyone think that we were bringing this person in just because I knew him or something. He looked like the concept art that someone who didn't even know him had drawn. And, it was actually my boss had to encourage me, like, put Sam's resume in the pile, because I was too scared to do it, because I would think everyone thought I was, just trying to get my friends a job or whatever. But he was perfect, and his audition was perfect, But for years before that, he was just around. I brought him on tours. I tried to get him onto, I think, Battlefront at one point, or Republic Commando. I was auditioning him for stuff all the time, kind of under the radar, and he was just kind of hanging out because he was a huge fan. He knew everything there was to know about Lucas, not just the movies, but LucasArts. The not just the Star Wars stuff, but the
Monkey Island,
Grim Fandango, Full Throttle, Sam and Max, Day of the Tentacle. He knew about all that stuff, He's the real deal, and he did these comedy shorts. Yeah. Anyway, there's that.
Okay, so this one's from listener Sarah Cole. She says, has there ever been a sound effect change over the lifespan of Star Wars that has irritated you as a sound person? Any sound change that has, just being an expert in sound, has just irked you?
Like a sound change
in the movies.
In the movies. Oh, I see. At one point there was kind of like a shotgun-y type of sound on Luke's blaster in the swing across the chasm in Episode 4 in one of the versions. I think the first special editions, that kind of went away. I mean, I don't know. I feel like Matt Wood does a great job of just making the movies a little better and better. I'll tell you what I loved is that they added that sort of echo delay. They're coming through. Those kind of details I really liked that they added. I was a bigger fan of the Crate Dragon yell in the original, but I also understand why they changed it. It's hard because every time I talk about original sounds, I talk about this a lot on Star Wars Oxygen, which is that we're always in love with what we grew up with, right? But what we grew up with wasn't perfect, but I guess that's kind of the point, And if you grew up, watching the special editions first, then that's going to be what you love. But there are some sounds that I liked ahead of time. I remember when I was just starting at LucasArts, I had to take the Phantom Menace and figure out where I had a VHS copy of the Phantom Menace, and I was like entering descriptions into our sound effects library of what these sounds were. And I remember at one point the Naboo starfighter, I tracked it, had like 3 different sounds attached to its laser. There's like the main one on the close-up, but in some of the battles, I realized that Sky Sound was just going for like an interesting tapestry of different blaster sounds, right? As opposed to being super literal about it. They were going, they were using just different blasters in order to make a really pleasing mix of different Star Wars sounds. And creatively, that's the right decision. Sometimes if you're too literal about sound, it actually, I think, just gets a little boring. If you just hear the droid starfighter fighting against the Naboo starfighters, it's like, well, no, it's Star Wars. Make it cool, Sometimes you can cheat the edges a little bit. You can cheat the sort of reality, the rules that you set about in universe, just to make something sound good. There are a lot of cheats, and sometimes those are the exciting parts.
Okay, so here's the last question. This comes from podcast listener Kevin Crayley Jr., who listens to everything and is a huge fan of
Kenny. I love Kenny.
So he had 2 questions, but the one that I think we're going to end with is you're the host of Star Wars Oxygen, and you do stuff with Rebel Force Radio. What has been your favorite thing about Star Wars and doing the podcast Star Wars Oxygen, the music of John Williams? And also to go with this, you can also promote what's coming up, what we can expect next month, or you just released an episode this last week, so anyone who hasn't heard it yet, you can tell them what to expect from that show and promote yourself as well.
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity. So I got to say my favorite part about working on Star Wars Oxygen is how much it's given back to me and how much I've learned. I thought I knew a lot about these scores, having edited them a million ways to Sunday, working on games and having heard them repeatedly in games. and just as a fan. I mean, I used to sit there and read the novels in the 90s that were coming out, and I would sit there and just have the box set that was released on the stereo in the background as I read, Kevin Anderson's Jedi Academy trilogy or the Zahn trilogy or whatever was newly out at the time. I just listened again and again and again to those scores. Well, I have to tell you, I've learned so much in researching these scores, and the fear of talking about something and not knowing what you're talking about and being able to stay ahead of fans has kept me very sharp, because we all know a lot about these scores, right? So it forces me to dig deeper, to research further, to just go and go and go. So in my spare time, I find myself just on my iPad or my phone or whatever, on my lunch break, just kind of reading articles. I mean, I found whole, white pages and theses, doctoral thesis on how this stuff was recorded and interviews and all kinds of things that you can cross-reference. And Rinsler's books are just a wealth of knowledge and liner notes, and that's my favorite part. As far as what the show is about right now, we're going through Return of the Jedi, and we just went through all of what we call source music, which is music that exists in the world that the characters themselves can hear. So, of course, Lapti Nek and the Ewok song and anything happening in Jabba's palace, like Jabba's Baroque recital, and, of course, talking about, the original versus special edition music changes, the music changes are by far bigger in that movie than any other movie. And coming up, we're moving into the prequel trilogy in 2015, and that'll probably take us all the way up to the release of Episode 7. And the plan is to get to Episode 7 around the time that it arrives in theaters, and we've got a soundtrack to talk about. So if you follow the show, you can listen to it all the way into a new movie, and that's the really exciting part. And then the other thing is that the show is, what I like to call evergreen. It's not just the weekly news. It's talking about movies that are years old. So if you haven't heard Oxygen, we're finding that a lot of people are listening to one episode and then they're binge listening to all of the previous episodes, which is by far the greatest compliment that I could get. And I'm just really, really grateful to everyone for listening and for folks like you for having me, giving me a chance to talk about it.
Thank you. Yeah, and that show made my wife a podcast listener, so she's been having me turn off, podcasts when we're in the car because she's like, I don't relate to all this. But that one, she's like, I need to listen to all of these now, so get them all.
That's great. Well, tell her thank you, please.
I think the tuba comments got her, the tuba player having his heyday.
That's right. Yes, today's my big day. Yep. I'm going to go there, show them all. It's cut.
Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time and a little more than we had agreed to. But thank you so much. This is fantastic, and I look forward to hearing your show every single month.
Oh, please, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad we worked it out, and it's absolutely my pleasure anytime.